also want to take the opportunity, if I could, to pay tribute to Wayman and Savvy and all the other people who... It's very obvious you all know what a great job they do. One slight domestic announcement, if I could, very important, I can relate to this. Someone has lost, a woman has lost her chunky woolen jacket, which is a combination of white and grey colouring. If anyone sees it, could they please take it to the registration desk so the cardigan and the owner can be reconciled. Right, before I introduce our really interesting lineup of speakers, we've got one speaker who will be joining us shortly, Diane Rabbit. I just want to say just a few words about the role of the TUC in supporting exactly the same aim to unite against fascism. The TUC role, and it puts decent resources into this role, is one of raising concerns with our government regarding the EDL and their targeting of Muslim communities, including in my own home borough of Tower Hamlets. The TUC, and indeed my own union, the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, which is affiliated to UAF, we take every opportunity we can to press government to prosecute those trying to intimidate anti-fascist campaigners and trade unionists through dreadful things like the Red Watch website. We will, as we do in every election, be trying to mobilise the 6 million workers who make up the TUC to get out and vote in the May elections against the far right and everything that they stand for. Colleagues, you know as I know that apathy is our worst enemy here. Of course, the TUC, as it does in a range of other areas, gives support to individual unions to help with campaigning in the workplace against racism and the right wing. I feel whether we're trade unionists here, whether we're community activists here, whether we're anti-fascist campaigners here, or probably a combination of all three for many of us, we all have a common aim. Occasionally the tactics may differ, but we all have a common aim of respect, equality and tolerance. And I'm now going to introduce the first speaker, who I'm sure will cover this theme in a very interesting way. Speakers have been asked to keep to a maximum of 8 minutes. If speakers stick to that brief, in fact if speakers even take a little less, then we will have time before 2:45 to throw the session open to any questions or comments from yourself. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Edie Friedman, who's the Executive Director of the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, which was founded in 1976. The organisation campaigns and runs education programmes for an important voice on the issues of anti-racism, diversity, refugees, asylum seekers and immigration. It tries to reach out to all those who are persecuted in our society and give them help. So you're very welcome, Edie.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? I'm not quite tall enough yet for the podium, so I'm going to sit here. So if you can't hear, if you could just signal in some way. Thank you very much, and thank you to UAF for inviting me. I'd like to start with a tiny little bit of autobiography. I was born in 1949 in the west side of Chicago. The west side of Chicago, like the east end of London, is the place where the black community and many immigrants settled. My parents were first-generation Americans, born to Russian immigrants. The civil rights and the peace movement of the 1960s profoundly influenced me, as they did many in my generation. And I have to say, I feel a real sense of privilege that I had the opportunity to be a student in the 1960s and to be able to participate in some of the movements for social change that took place. These were exhilarating times, but they were also dangerous times, as some students and other activists had to pay with their lives in order to have their voice heard. In the early 1970s, I moved to Britain, and as been said, I started the Jewish Council for Racial Equality in 1976. So now, almost 35 years later, I often think about what has changed in the field of anti-racism during this time. So what do I conclude? And I'll be very brief. I see that racism has been pretty well removed from the political agenda, with the exception of the intermittent interest in the Stephen Lawrence case. I see the proliferation of Islamophobia in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, so much of it resonating with descriptions of Jewish refugees who came to Britain at the turn of the century and before the outbreak of the Second World War. Muslims today are vilified just as Jews were in the past, as aliens who are incapable of being able to adapt to the British way of life. And I see the continued demonization of asylum seekers and refugees by both certain sections of the press and by certain politicians. This demonizing also echoes descriptions of Jewish migrants as Jewish refugees, as people who take our jobs and abuse our hospitality and our generosity. I see the continuation of anti-Semitism as evidenced by attacks in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, and by the frightening behavior both on and off the football terraces. Twice in the last few months, fans of Tottenham, who I believe have strong Jewish support, and I say that as someone who knows absolutely nothing about football, nor do I really want to, but they have been victims of quite vicious anti-Semitic attacks. And as Holocaust Memorial Day reminded us just a few weeks ago, which is still very much in our shadow, as well as the subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, and Darfur, about how little we have actually learned. But let me focus back home again, because these realities need to be seen in the context of the austerity measures and the breakup of our beloved NHS and welfare state. All in the knowledge that these cuts would disproportionately affect Black and minority communities and those who are the most vulnerable in our society. And of course we know that economic uncertainty provides perfect fodder for the far right, as we are forced to compete for the ever-shrinking slice of the very small piece of cake that's left. And glaring headlines suggesting, for example, that there is no money for facilities for older people while undeserving asylum seekers are given luxury accommodation resonate with many, as does the prospect of hordes of Bulgarians and Romanians coming soon to a neighborhood near you. Well, given these circumstances, it's difficult to feel optimistic and somehow remain positive, but we must. We know that we cannot control external forces and that racism will continue to thrive. But we must make sure that Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of racism do not define us as to who we are, because such definitions can cause us to only look inward, allowing victimhood to negate what our contribution could be to the wider society. We must make sure that we in the anti-racism movement do not allow ourselves to be divided by either international or internal pressures, which can pull us in opposite directions. But it is not only the absence of divisions which we must demonstrate, but we must demonstrate unity to ourselves and to others. And we must show what we hold in common rather than what divides us. The work that I've done in the past of bringing Black, Asian, and Jewish people together shows how relatively little contact there is between us. And we know that a vacuum can be created when there isn't any contact. And this vacuum can be filled with misunderstandings and stereotypes. And we know where that can lead. So in conclusion, I started by referring to the 1960s, and although we did not achieve everything we set out to achieve, I hope that some of the magic and some of the optimistic spirit of that period can serve as a source of inspiration to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edie. I think your message of optimism and working together really well taken. Our next speaker is Farouk Murad from the Muslim Council for Britain. He's a Secretary General and indeed a founding member of the Muslim Council in 1997, Britain's largest umbrella grouping of Muslim organisations. Farouk is widely involved in community development work and with several Muslim charities, so I'm delighted to ask you to say a few words, Farouk.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here once again at this wonderful conference organised by UAF United Against Fascism. Can I greet you all as our customers with the Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you all. Thank you. And I'd like to really commend and congratulate UF and also its dynamic duo, Sabi and Wayman, for their robust, uncompromising and ceaseless campaign to challenge and confront the scourge of racism and fascism. And particularly, can I also thank them for keeping Islamophobia right at the center of the anti-racism agenda. Racism and fascism has the habit of raising its head in new forms, in new ways, finding new currencies to be back in business. And it tries to find soft corners, soft spots in our psyche to get back and appear as harmless ideas that we can nurture in ourselves, in our society. And I would say currently in Europe, it is being pushed forward on the pretext of legitimate criticism of Islam, legitimate concern about Muslims, about erosion of our shared values, and about being overtaken, overrun by a foreign, some kind of Arab, Asian culture. And on the basis of that, fear and hatred is driven. And that is the definition of racism. At the end of the day, it is the same old thing. Hatred of a people, fear of a people and their culture, and seeing them as inferior to what we believe is the common culture, perhaps. And unfortunately, even politicians fall for it. Let's not forget, not long ago, early 2011, we had this most incredible attack on multiculturalism. The speech by David Cameron, our Prime Minister in Munich. We had similar sentiments expressed by Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, that multiculturalism is dead. The days are over. We all have to become the same, one and the same. How ridiculous. That was seen as the way to counter terrorism. That was presented as a way to counter extremism. That we do not tolerate and accept this multiculturalism. I thought this is how we have managed to create, through multiculturalism, societies where we as human beings have managed to strengthen this our society and make and produce most powerful, most successful communities. Another old tactic that we are very concerned about, which is back in business, is what I would say colorizing and racializing and regionalizing the crime in our society. Yes, a lot of people do a lot of bad things. They exist in all communities. Grooming is an awful crime, exploitation of vulnerable. We should have zero tolerance. And our faith has zero tolerance for it. Absolutely no room for this kind of behavior. But bad things happen in all communities. Priests, high-ranking priests have been found to abuse the vulnerable who were entrusted to them. Even high-ranking politicians lately have been found to abuse their power, again exploiting perhaps the vulnerable. But it's always when a Muslim comes to crime, the headlines are Pakistani men, Muslim men, and suddenly columns are filled, and debates begins about the culture, what's wrong with this state, what's wrong with these people. This is very clear cross racism and fascism that is around. I would say by far and large untapped. And what we need to do is to understand that Islamophobia breeds alienation, divide, contempt, violence, extremism. When Anders Breivik in Norway decides to kill 90 people of his own background, he was a victim of Islamophobia. Or rather, Islamophobia creates not just terrorism on one side, or terrorism on both sides. This is not good news for our society. We need to stand together and confront and understand what Islamophobia is and how it operates and how it has been peddled and moved forward. Finally, when it comes to the ideology of the far right, BNP and EDL, the protests, the demonstrations, day in, day out in our neighborhoods, in the north, in the south, in the Midlands, they go on, and very rarely covered, as they should be in the media. Whilst we may have defeated these forces in our local and national elections here, but I think a real threat is looming in terms of how these forces are trying to collude, join hands, find partners across Europe through the European Parliament. Therefore, it is absolutely vital, and MCB will be working together with UAF to ensure that we mobilize votes. There is no room for complacency. We mobilize votes across the country to ensure that no BNP members are elected in the European Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Varun. I think we are all here because we recognise so well there is no room for complacency, so thank you. Our next speaker is Diana Abbott, Member of Parliament, who currently has the brief of Shadow Public Health Minister. Diana was the first black woman elected to the House of Commons back in 1987. And who knows, Diana, but I was one of the ones campaigning for you in that election. Diana is another formidable campaigner, like our previous two speakers, for equality and human rights, who gives staunch support to the anti-racist movement. So I'm delighted to invite you to say a few words, Diana.
Comrades, I'm very pleased to be here to say a few words about the importance of fighting racism, fascism and Islamophobia. And the first thing to say is that we always have to be mindful that we are in the middle of a recession. And history teaches us that in the middle of a recession, where ordinary people are frightened for their jobs, for their futures, for their living standards, you inevitably get a rise in racism and fascism. And I'm surprised to hear some members of my own party talk as if the fact that you can find working class people complaining about immigrants is some kind of revelation. As if it's something that you couldn't, one has never come across before. It is always the response of communities under pressure to seek to scapegoat the other, whether the other is Jewish, whether the other is Irish, or whether the other is Muslim. This is not some brand new phenomenon. It is part of what happens in very difficult economic times. Now, I've got a bit of a cold, which I caught canvassing in Eastleigh for my sins. I hope I got at least one of the 10,000 votes we gathered. But I'm very fearful that the mainstream political parties will take the wrong lesson from the rise of UKIP. I am very fearful that the mainstream political parties, including my own party, the Labour Party, will believe that because of the rise of UKIP, we all have to take one step to the right on issues like immigration. I believe for any party that considers itself a progressive party, moving to the right on immigration at the current time is just a spiral downwards. Colleagues in my own party, colleagues I respect, will tell me of all these frightened white working class voters that they meet on the doorstep in West Yorkshire and wherever else. But why are working people, both black and white, fearful and apprehensive in the current climate? Well, one reason why they're so fearful and apprehensive is the deregulation of the labour market, which New Labour was so proud of. It is deregulated labour markets and rampant and exploitative employers which drive down wages, not immigrants. And I get particularly upset when I hear that immigrants are creating too much pressure on the welfare state and the NHS. Without immigrants, Britain wouldn't have an NHS. My mother was that generation of West Indian woman that came here to build this country's health service after the war, and I consider it disrespectful to that generation and their successors in our health service, in our public sector, to only talk about immigrants as if they are a drain, and never to talk about their contribution to keeping our public services going. And so, one thing that I will do, so long as I have a breath, is to resist in my own party a sort of phony workerism, which says, oh, all these poor working class people are worried about immigrants, so we must adopt draconian right-wing anti-immigrant policies too. It's a phony workerism. We need to address the real issues facing working people in this country: deregulation of labour markets, the weakening of trade unions, lack of job security, wage levels, which in real terms are not rising. We need to address those real issues, not slide off into a scapegoating of Britain's immigrant community, which has done so much for Britain since the war. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was the importance of multiculturalism, because multiculturalism has become something of a swear word in the Westminster bubble in recent years. Even my good friend Trevor Phillips felt it appropriate to attack multiculturalism. Well, you know, the attacks on multiculturalism need to be called out for what they are: utterly dishonest and utterly wrong. First of all, multiculturalism is a euphemism for the very black and minority ethnic presence in the society. It is a euphemism for their feelings of unhappiness about a black and minority ethnic presence as such. And to talk about, they love to talk about, oh, well, the problem is these ethnic minorities don't mix. And I've heard it once, I've heard it a million times. The trouble is these ethnic minorities don't mix. Well, I am old enough to remember what could happen to black families or Asian families or Muslim families who moved onto all white estates in London and other parts of the country. I am old enough to remember that many local authorities pursued blatant